I am really excited to be here, and I just want to thank all of you because I'm a dreamer too. So we dreamers, we like to get stuff done too as well. And I just like to talk about some of my favorite aspects. I'll talk a little bit about our Moon to Mars objectives and our strategy for how we're going to try to get to Mars. But then I want to drill down in a little bit and talk about something that I think is really exciting, which is human-machine teaming. We do have a lot of challenges ahead of us to get to Mars. And I'm personally excited. I feel like we are on a path. Very importantly, we have a transportation system that is going to get us to deep space between the rocket and the Orion spacecraft that's capable of protecting a human and bringing a human back at the much higher Mach numbers than we have from low Earth orbit. So this is a great time as we prepare to try again on November 14th to launch Artemis 1. We know we're going to get that rocket off, and we know we're going to learn a lot on the first mission. We have hardware in place and in development for the first 4 missions, and a few pieces going on the 5th mission as well. So those are all test flights for us to understand the hardware and start to get a sense of the operations. But it's really important that we talk about what we are doing and how what we are doing is going to get us to Mars, which is the goal. I just want to make a comment, which is that I was very inspired by the Apollo program. My father recorded on the audio from the television on a reel-to-reel tape recorder, got all us kids out in the middle of the night to watch and listen on the television. And I was done. At that point, I knew I wanted to go to space. And so what I'm excited about is now that we are actually getting ready to go back to the moon and out into deep space, this is inspiration for a whole tidal wave of engineers, scientists, aviators, and explorers. And it's the Artemis generation. So it must be my physics background, but I always like to start with first principles. So this is actually one of the most important charts. I show it almost every time I speak, and it is, why do we go to space? What are the benefits to humanity? That's really important to NASA because we're a government organization, which means we are here to serve the people. That is our responsibility. Now, there are 3 pillars that I've put up here: science, national posture, and inspiration. Science, of course, learning about the universe, learning about ourselves, learning about our climate. National posture is leadership in science and technology, understanding and partnering in a positive way around the world. Those international relationships are very important because they help us set norms of behavior, which are the things that we want to do together. And then, of course, there's inspiration, just human inspiration, but also the inspiration for that next generation. Now, I bet you that you think one of those pillars is the most important. Almost everybody has one that they prefer. But I will tell you that after decades in spaceflight, I know that the entire stakeholder community is interested in at least one of those things. So maybe you're not interested in all of them, but someone is, which means that from my standpoint, our most powerful activities take into account all 3 of these things. Because if we don't take them all into account, there are stakeholders, and some of whom fund us, who will not be happy because they're not seeing the pillar that they care most about out there. So as we go forward, it's really important to come back to these first principles and make sure that the things that we're doing are addressing this. What's significant about this is that we do have other countries, we have private entities, individuals and companies who all have their own why, but don't forget, they have no obligation to benefit all of humanity. They have their own why. This is what sets NASA apart. This is our responsibility, is to benefit all of humanity. So this is where we started on our journey to the Moon to Mars strategy. We set up some guiding principles from the beginning. And that the first one is incredibly important, to set up an objective-based approach. So I have seen a lot of so-called strategies that look like a very nice list of things to do, but it's really important to set objectives and actually say what it is that you're trying to achieve from a goal standpoint and what the objectives are to achieve that. Architect from the right, that gets to setting that big aspirational goal. If you start with your whole strategy for the next 5 or 10 years is just to go to the moon, that's where you're going to land and that's where you're going to stay. And in fact, in my mind, I'll tell you, Mars is not aspirational enough, but I'll get to that in just a moment. So you have to architect with your aspiration from the right, and then you execute from today to that point. And as we know, we have hardware, we have science, we have things that we've learned, and we have to take all of those into consideration as we move towards that goal. Staying with a consistent plan. One of my biggest concerns is that we do have a political system that changes over. And so political resilience is really, really important. This plan has to have that. It has to be something that we can all get behind and that there is stakeholder support. But it's not enough to have an awesome plan. We also have to talk about it. We have to consult with all of our stakeholders, and we have to communicate so that everyone understands what the plan is. They automatically know, especially inside NASA, what's your place in that plan and why are you doing it? And so that's inside and outside. So the aspirational goal is to create a blueprint for sustained human presence and exploration throughout the solar system. So what we're saying here is we are going to go practice on the moon. We're going to go practice on Mars. We have a lot to learn, and we know that. Mars is much harder than the moon. We know that too. But really what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we repeatably go to any destination in the solar system, and as Dr. Lal suggested, perhaps beyond at some point. There is an order to these things. There is a sense of, what do you have to know first? How do you optimize around that? In some ways, it's like city planning on steroids, right? You got to have the whole thing figured out. So that's really the aspiration and the goal. We all took a look at that. I asked the senior technical leadership at the agency, all the deputies of our mission directorates, including aeronautics, by the way, because I think they're going to be important in the future as we see Ingenuity helicopter on Mars. We'll hear more about that in a moment, but I asked them all to get together and create the objectives what do we need to know to get to Mars to demonstrate the ability to have this blueprint, learn from it, tweak it, and evolve from that. So the objectives that they came back with fell into 4 general buckets. The transportation and the habitation ones, everyone's familiar with that. You got to have transportation, you need a rocket. And for humans, you need something that will protect them in deep space and also get them back to Earth. And that's fairly straightforward. We're working in that. We also lump into that suits, transport vehicles, rovers, and such. But science is absolutely central. I go back to the 3 pillars. Science has to be front and central in everything that we do. That has not always been the case. Sometimes it's been an afterthought. I, of course, was part of the generation that built the International Space Station. We learned that doing science on the space shuttle was tantalizing, but we only flew the shuttle 5 or 6 times a year for about 10 days to 2 weeks at a time. So the space station gave us the opportunity to do science 24/7. So we really need to be thinking that way. How do we maximize the science output? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Infrastructure is incredibly important. Maybe it might not be for the moon, which is 3 days away, but as we go out into the solar system, if we really want to maximize the science that we're doing, we're going to have to stay longer periods of time because the trip is so long. So it's okay for a test flight to have humans land on Mars and spend 30 days for a 6-month trip there and a 6-month trip back. It's okay for a test flight. But if you look at how we can maximize the science, that is not a good ratio long term. We really need to be thinking very effectively about that. And in order to do that, we have to have the infrastructure that supports humans for long durations in deep space. It has the added benefit that infrastructure encourages our commercial partners and industry to follow us. Infrastructure benefits industry and allows them to close their business case, addressing that second pillar of national leadership in science and technology. And in addition to that, operations. So this is the one that's probably the least obvious, unless you've been at NASA for the last 2 decades. The way we operated the space shuttle is very different than the way we operate the space station. And we were on short duration flights that were very intense. They were focused around a specific payload. That is not the way we operate on the International Space Station now. And we're going to have to learn a whole new paradigm doing science in partial gravity on the surface of another planet. We also identified that there are some recurring tenets that all of our objectives have to address. And they include items like, let's make sure I've got my list, international collaboration, industry collaboration, responsible use, and interoperability. All really good things, but it was kind of ridiculous to repeat them for every objective, so we pulled them out into recurring tenets. It's important to know that we did this with consultation. We had a public consultation process, one inside NASA, one with industry, academia, and nonprofits, and another one with our international partners. And this is going to be a continuous process. We think our objectives are pretty good. They're probably going to stay stable until we start learning things from going to the moon. But we will have to always be thinking about them and talking about them. So now that we have a set of objectives, let's ask about architecture development. How does that meet? So I talked about architecting from the right and executing from the left. Well, we're in that messy place right in the middle. We're already executing. We've got a rocket on the pad. We've got to be thinking about all of these things. But one of the interesting aspects of architecture development is that where you end depends on what question you answer first and what you optimize around. So I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's start with when we go. Let's say humans to Mars, specific date, or are you going to index to something else, some other thing happening? Like when we get this capability, we should go. Or is it get there and get back within a limited total duration? And that's actually a really important question, and I'll talk about why in a few minutes. So now you have to start asking questions like, well, if we have to get there by a certain date, then tech development might be off the table because we don't have time for it. Major systems take years to develop. So maybe we just take what we got and go. And what do you assume about what assets you have that can do that? And if you have that shorter duration, it's really going to drive your architecture selections. And then you have to ask, what do we do? What we have time to do when we're there? And this gets a little bit to some of those science questions. If you're going to bolt, pick up rocks and bolt home. Well, that's one approach. It's not the approach we're taking right now on Perseverance. We're taking our time and we're picking the optimum samples to bring home. So one option would be to stay in orbit because you simply don't have time to develop a system for a lander. This is where these kinds of questions from the beginning start to drive you if you keep, following the thread from wherever you started. And of course, this is going to influence why we go, because if it's all about getting there by a certain date, well, maybe the reason we're going then is to beat some deadline. Or if we have mission pull, we're just trying to drive so that current programs are utilized. And maybe we're just trying to expand our human spaceflight experience. But it will also influence where we go, because we're going to go where we can get to the fastest. And that gets back to orbital instead of landing on the surface. And it also will influence who will go, because the number of crew is going to be based on the time available to develop systems. And you can go faster with fewer crew because you have less of a logistics tail. Let's start with a different question. What if we started with why we go? To demonstrate the capability, to establish a sustained human presence, and for specific science objectives. Now you're going to see that the questions you have to answer as you start pulling the thread are different. Are you going to the easiest spot you can get to? Or are you going to the best location to maximize your science? Or where the resources are for sustained presence? What do we need to meet the mission goals? We need camping gear, or do we need real infrastructure? And this gets to the science piece. If you're going to stay and you're going to maximize, you need to provide the science infrastructure or big infrastructure for a long stay. Who will go? Well, if you're going, again, to scoop up rocks and bring them home, you may only need 2 crew. But if you really want to do science, then you're going to need the scientific expertise and a larger crew complement to stay. It also drives the round trip time to get to and come back. And the stay duration drives the surface and system support mass. Humans take a staggering amount of logistics. We see that every day on the space station. The science and the humans, we're constantly having to send supplies up to the station. And our landed mass begins to drive very big challenges, like, if you want to do it super efficiently to land a lot of cargo on the moon or on Mars, we're going to need some entry, descent, and landing systems that are bigger than the ones that we use. Hence, NASA Space Technology Directorate's new Lofted experiment, which will be going up in November, to look at extremely large inflatable decelerators as a part of the tech roadmap. And of course, when we can go and return, do we go now with what we have, wait for new technology, or wait until all the elements are developed? So you can see where you enter that circle and the questions you ask lead to a different set of questions and possibly with a different outcome. And one of the great examples of this that I'd like to give, Pavia told you all about nuclear propulsion, so I'm not going to go through this. She did tell you that we're interested in both thermal and electric. One of the things she didn't talk about is, why is nuclear thermal so great for humans? Well, it's because it's faster, right? That's great, right? But what's the inherent assumption? The inherent assumption is how much risk it is to send humans out into space. Humans are very fragile creatures. So we want to go fast to limit that exposure. Well, suppose we burned down all those risks and had people living aboard the space station for 3 years at a time. Maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe nuclear electric is okay. And oh, by the way nuclear thermal propulsion systems work, you turn it on full and get the thrust that you need and start headed towards Mars, and then you turn the system off. And then when you get close, you turn it back on to decelerate 5 or 6 months later. So most engineers who are designing for safety and robustness are like, really? You have an engine that you are going to fire once, turn it off, and then try turning it on again 6 months later, and it's got to work or everybody's going to die. Really? So there are some really big trades that we have to make with these systems. I'll just talk about the science objectives for a moment. This is an eye chart. You can go take a look at them. What I thought was very exciting about the discussion that we had with our partners was we had been initially very focused on our decadal. The National Academies does the decadal study, and we were looking at that for heliophysics, for astrophysics, and for, of course, lunar and planetary science. But we reframed them after consultation with industry, academia, and our international partners. We still have lunar and planetary science objectives, but we actually took astrophysics out and made them physics objectives because they're really about the nature of the universe. Obviously, human and biological sciences, lots to study, lots to be ready for before we can go to Mars. What I thought was also very intriguing is they picked 2 new buckets. One is science enabling, which means it is technologies that and objectives that help us maximize the science we do with humans. So you're going to see in there things like, we have to develop a formal training program for astronauts. And that's obvious, right? Okay, but why are we doing that? We're doing it because we want to maximize the science. In addition to that, they have an applied physics bucket, which is what is the science we can do to enable everybody else's objectives? And a great example of that is some of the science behind ISRU. So there's some foundational science we still don't have yet. So I thought this was a really interesting outcome. Let's get back to humans for a moment. So now I'm going to kind of get to the point of the talk. I've been hinting at it all along. We know that humans are staggeringly difficult to support. We also know that there are unknown health risks, serious health risks associated with long duration spaceflight. We do have a tech roadmap that will help us along the path here. We believe that we can get about 85% of our life support objectives done on the International Space Station before it's decommissioned in 2030, and that's great. Some we are going to have to do in deep space, and we're looking to Gateway to help us get to those, and of course our surface operations as well. But it's really interesting when you look at this, the transformation that's happened in the science community. First of all, they understand now what the massive value of humans in the loop for science. I'll give you just a couple of examples. One would be that in the 25 years and the multiple rovers that we have operated on the surface of Mars, we are now just exceeding the total distance traveled on the last 4 Apollo missions by humans. So their mobility and creativity, it is a significant boost to the amount of science that you can do. The power and the mobility that supports human beings can do a lot of science. And I think the science community is starting to twig onto that. Instead of trying to sneak, an extra watt out of a rover, you're talking about power systems that have tremendous capability and can support a lot of science. One of my other favorite examples, Dr. Zurbuchen, our head of science, says, our first Perseverance rover sample, it took us about 3 days to figure out it was sandy and all the sand fell out of the sample tube. How long do you think it would take a human to go, oh, look at that? Maybe less than 5 seconds. So we really have the opportunity to maximize the science that we can do, but humans are fragile, and we're beginning to have this discussion. It's pretty annoying when one of your most powerful science instruments has to sleep 8 hours a day and also needs time to eat and do other things. And that's sort of the dismaying part for the science community about humans. So where are we going with all this? Well, the answer is human-machine teaming. This is one of my favorite subjects. I worked on it a lot when I worked at DARPA about 7 or 8 years ago. How do you optimize around humans and machines? So automation is one thing, but autonomy is another thing. I would love to say that we are there. If you're interested in autonomy and AI, you should go listen to the DARPA podcast on third wave AI. And they talk about where we're really at and where we're likely to get to. It is absolutely possible to optimize around a single thing. We're learning how to do that very well. It's having a huge impact in industry and in other places. But what humans do is they optimize across multiple parameters at once. And that is extremely hard to do. So we need to figure out what do humans do best and what do machines do best and how to mix them together. So I'd just like to show this slide so that to remind you that we are going to be using a lot of hardware on the moon that has heritage to Mars. And each of these pieces of hardware, we have to understand how humans will interact with them, how they will interact with each other to optimize the time for humans on the surface of the moon and Mars for science. So this is brand new, hot off the press. I love this. It's actually the image through a helmet of an astronaut. And this is the intention, to have something like an Ingenuity-like helicopter. You have a heads-up display right there in your helmet. And in addition to that, you can communicate not just with others, but with the rovers, scientific equipment. And that's what I'm talking about. We have to figure out how to optimize around that. One of the things that really excites me is if we can actually get humans to Mars faster by not sending humans at all. If we had a very, very, very high, well, we do, Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter can get to about 0.1 to 0.5 meter resolution. So if we had resolution that was down to 0.1 meter across the entire surface of Mars, and then we gave every citizen scientist a headset, and a VR, and said, go take a walk. Would you please go take a walk on Mars for us and plant a little virtual flag wherever you see something interesting? Imagine that, if we could have thousands of human beings sitting on Earth, but walking on Mars and helping us guide the science for the future. All right, I think I'm out of time, so I will finish. I think I have time maybe for 1 or 2 questions, but I hope you will also be thinking about the human-machine teaming and how we can get more science done on Mars. Thank you.
We have time for 1 question.
Hi. So please correct me on this because there's a chance I'm a little bit unclear. I'm not quite sure about the emphasis on sending humans faster, because to me, it seems like most of the risks are associated with our presence on the surface of the planet. So since you mentioned to utilize the advantages of NTP, I think that can just cuts the time to half. Wouldn't that be more beneficial to utilize that in terms of carrying more cargo, because that seems to be contributing more for safety of our mission?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what I was trying to show was some of the complexity of these decisions. And what I didn't show is the huge risks to humans. I mean, radiation protection for humans in deep space. That's something that we've got a notion of how to solve. We're going to have to solve it on the moon, right? I mean, that's another whole thing, is we're realizing we need to get better at predicting solar storms. If we've got humans cruising around on the surface of the moon or Mars, we need to predict them, we need to understand them, and we forecast them, not just, oh, look at that, it happened. And so we think that there are ways to mitigate it once you're down on the surface, but we're not sure how to mitigate it completely on the trip. So we really need to go as fast as we can. And also some of that time frame may be in, reduced gravity, all those things. So those are things we don't understand very well. Maybe,
Before you go, Deputy Administrator Melroy, we have a little gift for you. We've researched all the Mars globes out there, and we picked the fanciest one, and we want to present this to you. Hold on 1 second.
wow. Oh my gosh, that's beautiful. Look at that.
We'd like to present this to you on behalf of NASA and the Mars Society, working together on our shared vision of sending humans to Mars.
Thank you. Thank you so much.